There is a layer of cognitive processing that operates continuously, beneath deliberate thought, beneath conscious decision-making, beneath the part of the mind that reads, plans, and reasons. Most people are aware that this layer exists in a general sense. They know that habits run automatically, that emotional responses arrive before conscious analysis does, that certain patterns of thinking and behavior seem to persist regardless of how many times they are deliberately addressed. What fewer people understand is the specific mechanism by which this layer is shaped, and the specific conditions under which it is most receptive to being gradually and meaningfully updated. Sleep is one of those conditions. Not in the mystical sense that is sometimes attached to the idea of subconscious reprogramming, not through any process that bypasses deliberate engagement or produces change without effort, but in a specific, neurologically grounded sense that research on memory consolidation, emotional processing, and cognitive restructuring during sleep has been documenting for decades. The brain during sleep is not passive. It is engaged in a specific set of processing activities, consolidating the experiences of the day, integrating new information with existing cognitive structures, and strengthening or weakening the neural patterns associated with the material it has been given. What that material is, the cognitive and emotional content that enters the sleep period, is not irrelevant to what those processing activities produce. This session examines what that process actually involves, what the research tends to suggest about how it can be engaged with more deliberately, and what specific practices are most consistently associated with the gradual updating of the deeper cognitive patterns that shape automatic behavior, emotional responses, and habitual ways of interpreting experience. The language of subconscious reprogramming is used here as a descriptive shorthand, not as a claim that the process is instantaneous, guaranteed, or separable from the deliberate behavioral work that research consistently identifies as the primary driver of lasting cognitive change. What the sleep period may offer is a specific window of enhanced consolidation, one that can be engaged with more or less deliberately, with corresponding differences in what the consolidation process tends to produce. Part 1. What the brain actually does during sleep. Understanding what sleep does cognitively is the necessary starting point for understanding what the pre-sleep and sleep periods can and cannot contribute to the gradual updating of automatic cognitive patterns. The sleeping brain is not resting in the way the body is. It is engaged in a complex series of processing activities that serve multiple functions, physical restoration among them, but also, and perhaps more significantly for the purposes of this session, cognitive consolidation and integration. Research on sleep-dependent memory consolidation, a field that has developed substantially over the last 3 decades, has established several findings that are directly relevant here. The first is that sleep plays a specific and significant role in the consolidation of newly acquired information into longer-term memory structures. Material that has been learned or experienced during the day is processed during sleep in ways that determine how strongly it is encoded, how readily it can be retrieved, and how effectively it is integrated with existing knowledge and cognitive patterns. The second finding is that this consolidation process is not neutral with respect to emotional content. Research on the role of REM sleep in emotional memory processing suggests that sleep, particularly the REM phases that tend to occur in the later portions of the sleep period, may play a specific role in processing the emotional significance of experiences. Some research suggests that this processing tends to reduce the emotional intensity associated with difficult experiences while preserving the informational content, a process that may contribute to the psychological resilience associated with adequate sleep. The third finding is that the material most recently present in conscious awareness before sleep tends to receive prioritized processing during the consolidation period that follows. This is the mechanism most directly relevant to the idea of engaging the pre-sleep period more deliberately, and it is the one that provides the most direct behavioral implication for practice. What these findings collectively suggest is that the pre-sleep period is not simply a neutral transition between the day and the night. It is a period during which the material that will receive prioritized processing during sleep is being determined, and that determination is influenced, to a meaningful degree, by what is most vividly and most recently present in conscious awareness as sleep begins. This does not mean that what happens before sleep is the only determinant of what sleep consolidates. Many factors influence the consolidation process, and individual variation in sleep architecture and cognitive patterns means that the relationship between pre-sleep content and consolidation outcomes is not simple or direct. But the relationship exists, and it is sufficient to make the deliberate engagement of the pre-sleep period a practice worth taking seriously. Part 2. What automatic cognitive patterns are and how they form. The deeper cognitive patterns that most people refer to when they use the language of the subconscious are, in behavioral and cognitive psychology terms, a combination of several related phenomena. They include habitual patterns of attention, the characteristic ways a person tends to notice and weight different kinds of information in their environment. They include automatic emotional responses, the feelings that arise before conscious analysis in response to specific triggers. They include deeply established interpretive frameworks, the habitual ways a person makes sense of ambiguous situations, setbacks, interpersonal interactions, and their own capabilities. These patterns share a common characteristic. They operate largely below the threshold of deliberate conscious control. They are not typically chosen in the moment. They arrive, and their arrival shapes behavior in ways that often feel inevitable. That feel, in other words, like simply the way things are rather than like patterns that develop through experience and are maintained through repetition. Understanding that these patterns are learned, that they develop through accumulated experience, through consistent repetition, and through the reinforcement of specific interpretive and emotional responses, is the first step toward understanding how they might be gradually shifted. They are not, in most cases, simply chosen differently in a moment of deliberate decision. They are updated through the accumulation of new experience that is inconsistent with the existing pattern, particularly when that new experience is sufficiently consistent, sufficiently emotionally significant, and sufficiently reinforced during the consolidation processes that establish longer-term cognitive patterns. This is where the sleep period becomes relevant as more than just a restorative break. If the consolidation processes that occurred during sleep are involved in the strengthening and updating of cognitive patterns, including the automatic, below-threshold patterns that shape habitual behavior and emotional response, then the material that enters those processes is not irrelevant to the direction in which those patterns gradually shift over time. Deliberately providing that material, in the form of specific cognitive and emotional content engaged with in the pre-sleep period, is the basic logic behind the practices described in the remainder of this session. Part 3. 3 practices that may support gradual cognitive updating during sleep. The practices described here are grounded in what the available research tends to suggest about the conditions that support cognitive consolidation and the gradual updating of automatic patterns. They are not presented as guaranteed methods or as substitutes for the deliberate behavioral work that research consistently identifies as the primary driver of lasting cognitive change. They are presented as evidence-informed approaches that may complement that work, particularly when engaged with consistently and with realistic expectations about the timescale on which gradual cognitive updating tends to occur. Practice 1. Specific, concrete positive experience review. One of the more consistent findings in research on cognitive updating and neuroplasticity is that the brain tends to weight negative experiences more heavily than positive ones in the formation and maintenance of cognitive patterns. This negativity bias, documented across a wide range of cognitive and behavioral research, means that without deliberate counterbalancing, the automatic patterns that develop through experience tend to be skewed toward threat detection, pessimistic interpretation, and the overweighting of past failures and difficulties. Deliberately reviewing specific positive experiences before sleep, not in a vague or generalized way, but with enough concrete detail and emotional engagement that the experience is genuinely re-inhabited rather than simply noted, may provide the kind of emotionally significant positive content that the consolidation processes during sleep can work with. The specificity matters. Research on memory consolidation suggests that vague or abstract content is consolidated less effectively than specific, concrete, emotionally engaged content. A general sense of having had a reasonable day is less useful as consolidation material than the specific re-engagement with a particular moment of genuine competence, connection, or progress, held in enough detail that it produces something of the original emotional response. This practice is not positive thinking in the dismissive sense. It is a deliberate, evidence-informed attempt to provide the consolidation process with emotionally significant positive content that may gradually counterbalance the negativity bias in the automatic pattern formation that sleep consolidation tends to support. Practice 2. Deliberate mental rehearsal of intended responses. The research on mental rehearsal, discussed in broader terms in earlier sessions, has specific relevance to the pre-sleep context. Mental rehearsal involves the deliberate, specific imagining of performing an action or responding to a situation in a particular way. Research in this area has suggested that the cognitive and neurological preparation that occurs during deliberate mental rehearsal has meaningful overlap with the preparation that occurs during actual performance, and that rehearsal conducted in a calm, focused state may be particularly effective at establishing the cognitive patterns associated with the rehearsed response. The pre-sleep state, characterized by reduced external distraction, relaxed physical arousal, and the hypnagogic transition towards sleep, may be particularly well suited to this kind of rehearsal. The specific imagining of how a challenging situation will be met, how a habitual reactive response will be replaced by a more considered one, or how a desired behavioral pattern will be enacted, conducted in the calm of the pre-sleep period, provides the consolidation process with material that is directly relevant to the cognitive patterns associated with that behavior. The specificity of the rehearsal is again important. Vague intentions, a general sense of doing better, tend to produce less useful consolidation material than the specific, detailed imagining of a concrete situation with a concrete intended response. The more clearly the situation is held, and the more specifically the intended response is rehearsed, the more useful the content is as material for the consolidation process. Practice 3. Directed attention to the direction being pursued. Research on goal-directed cognitive processing suggests that the active maintenance of a clearly defined goal in conscious awareness tends to influence subsequent information processing in ways that are relevant to that goal, including, potentially, the processing that occurs during sleep. Spending a few minutes before sleep with a clearly and specifically defined direction held in focused attention, not with urgency or effortful striving, but with the calm, clear engagement of someone who knows what they are working toward and is committed to the process, may provide the consolidation process with material that is organized around that direction. This practice is distinct from anxious rumination about goals or outcomes, which research consistently associates with disrupted sleep and reduced consolidation quality. The distinction is between calm, focused engagement with a clear direction, which is associated with the kind of relaxed attention that supports effective pre-sleep states, and effortful, anxious engagement with uncertain outcomes, which is associated with the arousal states that tend to disrupt sleep onset and quality. The practice, done well, involves holding a clear, specific direction and calm attention for a brief period before sleep, long enough for it to be genuinely engaged with rather than simply noted, but not so long or so effortfully that it produces the arousal that disrupts sleep. A few minutes, consistently practiced, is likely more effective than occasional longer sessions conducted with less regularity. Part 4. What tends to interfere with this process? Understanding what tends to support gradual cognitive updating through the sleep period is only part of the practical picture. Understanding what tends to interfere with it is equally important, because the interference factors are, in many cases, more immediately present in most people's daily and nightly routines than the supportive practices are. High arousal content immediately before sleep is among the most consistently documented interference factors. Content that produces strong emotional responses, whether positive or negative, tends to produce elevated arousal states that are associated with delayed sleep onset, reduced slow-wave sleep depth, and reduced consolidation quality. The content that most commonly occupies the pre-sleep period for most people, news, social media, emotionally engaging entertainment, tends to fall into this category. The practical implication is not simply that these activities should be avoided before sleep because they disrupt rest, though that is true and well documented. It is that they tend to be the content that enters the consolidation process as the most recently and most vividly present material in conscious awareness, and that the material they provide is, in most cases, not the material that would be chosen if the pre-sleep period were being engaged with deliberately. Unresolved cognitive engagement, the unfinished processing of the day's events, worries, and unresolved problems, is a second interference factor that is both common and underrecognized. Research on pre-sleep cognitive activity consistently finds that unresolved concerns tend to occupy the pre-sleep period in ways that both disrupt sleep quality and provide the consolidation process with material organized around those concerns rather than around any more deliberately chosen direction. The structured end-of-day review practices discussed in earlier sessions, the deliberate analytical processing of the day's events before sleep, tend to reduce this interference by providing a specific, bounded opportunity to engage with the day's unresolved material before the pre-sleep period begins. The review functions as a completion activity, allowing the cognitive system to register that the material has been engaged with, which may reduce the automatic recycling of unresolved concerns during the pre-sleep transition. Inconsistency is the third interference factor worth naming directly. The practices described in this session are not effective as occasional interventions. Their potential contribution to gradual cognitive updating depends on the consistency with which they are practiced, because the gradual updating of automatic cognitive patterns requires accumulated, consistent exposure to the new material over an extended period. Occasional practice provides insufficient consistency to produce the kind of gradual pattern shift that sustained practice may support. Part 5. Realistic expectations and the actual timescale of change. The framing of subconscious reprogramming carries an implicit suggestion of relatively rapid, significant change, of cognitive patterns being updated in ways that produce noticeably different automatic responses within a short period. This framing is worth examining honestly, because the available research on how automatic cognitive patterns actually change tends to suggest a more gradual and more realistic picture. Automatic cognitive patterns, the deeply established interpretive frameworks, emotional response tendencies, and habitual attention patterns that most people mean when they refer to subconscious patterns, developed over extended periods through consistent experience and consistent reinforcement. They are maintained by multiple factors simultaneously, including the behavioral patterns they produce, the environmental conditions that trigger them, and the social contexts that normalize them. Changing them tends to require an extended period of consistent behavioral and cognitive work that provides the accumulated new experience from which the cognitive system gradually updates its predictions and its patterns. The sleep period, engaged with more deliberately, may contribute to that process, but it is a contribution to a longer arc of change, not a shortcut through it. Realistic expectations about this timescale are essential for two reasons. The first is practical. Without realistic expectations, the practices described in this session are likely to be abandoned before they have had sufficient time to produce any measurable effect. which produces exactly the kind of failure experience that tends to strengthen the low outcome expectancy patterns discussed in earlier sessions. The second is more fundamental. The realistic picture of how cognitive change actually occurs is more useful than an unrealistic one, because it points toward the actual conditions required for change: consistency, extended engagement, and the complementary behavioral work that the sleep period practices support but do not replace. What the available evidence does support, with reasonable confidence, is that consistently engaging the pre-sleep period with the specific practices described in this session, over a realistic timescale, and in combination with the deliberate behavioral work that research consistently identifies as primary, may contribute meaningfully to the gradual updating of the automatic cognitive patterns that shape how a person moves through their daily life. That contribution is modest in any given night. It is potentially significant across many nights, practiced consistently, as part of a broader and more comprehensive approach to deliberate cognitive and behavioral development. That is the realistic and evidence-informed picture. And it is, ultimately, a more useful one than any framing that promises more than the evidence supports.